Lecture 3, Part 4. If you spend some time with Gapminder now, get an idea of why economic growth matters, right? Economic growth matters because wealth creates health, and health implies longer life expectancy, lower infant mortality rates. Um, it also implies more CO2 emissions. It's a trade-off, right? I mean, you are increasing life expectancy, but it comes at a price. Now, the rule of 72 is the easiest way to understand why growing an economy matters for well-being. It's just a rough rule of thumb, and if you're a finance major, you can find more complicated formulas. But if you divide 72 by an economy's rate of growth, it's going to tell you roughly how fast a country's standard of living will double. So you can do it for your own bank account if you want. If you got $100 in the bank and you have a 1% rate of interest, it's going to take 72 years before that $100 becomes $200, right? So a 10% rate of growth implies your standard of living is going to double every 7.2 years, so within the decade. 1% growth rate implies 72 years, and if you have an even lower growth rate, 0.1%, you're talking about your standard of living doubling in 720 years. And this is the idea of exponential growth or compound interest, how things accumulate, and once they accumulate, it's like the snowball effect. It starts taking off where the snowball gets bigger faster, exponential growth. And so the idea of the rule of 72 is super important for understanding why politicians and economists push for increased productivity, right? Because increased productivity means faster growth. Faster growth means faster increases in standard of living. Faster increases in standard of living means, well, if you're a politician, you're going to get reelected. If you're an economist, you're just doing your job in terms of trying to increase everyone's well-being. So this is why compound interest matters, right? And why the stock market versus putting your money in the bank matters, right? If you play the stock market, there's more risk because a company may go under, but there's also more reward. So if you find an investment that's going to pay off in a great rate of return, say 100% rate of return, it's a startup company that actually works. Even though you face the risk of losing your money, if the company doesn't work, your money could double in less than a year. So if you invest 1,000 or 1,000,000, depending on your capital you've got to work with, your money could double within the year if you find an investment that pays a rate of return of, in this case, 100%, right? The safer you play it, the slower your money will double, the slower your well-being will increase, right? And so this growth, again, you can think of it, this exponential growth, and we can take the long run picture here of the Great Divergence. So we're looking at going back to 1000 BC, and you can see that the world's economy here, as measured in income per person or GDP per person, was pretty flat throughout most of history, recorded history here, up until what we looked at on Gapminder, which was around the Industrial Revolution, 1760 to 1840, right in there, when all of a sudden exponential growth took off, and you can see it increasing here in what we call the Great Divergence. You can see the Western world increasing their income per capita rapidly because the growth rate was so large. We started inventing all these amazing amazing things. And the biggest one, perhaps, being the washing machine, which freed up an incredible amount of labor because now people didn't have to spend every day 3 or 4 hours washing clothes, or especially women spending all that time hand washing clothes. Now people entered the labor force, all the different technologies we take for granted, telephone service, transportation service, all these investments in capital that made us more productive. And then you can see some of the countries that did not make the same investments in capital or lag behind, their GDP actually stayed the same or fell. This is the Great Divergence that up until about the year 2000, many of those economies really suffered. Now, as we globalized over the last 30, 40, 50 years, those economies, as we saw in Gapminder, were also increasing. They're not on this graph here, but they're also expanding. But I can't stress enough this idea of the rule of 72, the compound interest. The more productive we are, the faster we grow, the faster our incomes increase, the more well-being potential we have from the economy. All right, you can take a look at this, which is the Global Growth Tracker. You can look at world GDP, world economies by GDP. You can click on this link here, and it's going to go quarter by quarter how fast different parts of the world are growing. And you can see the map, which countries are going into recession, which countries are growing. And it's an interesting map looking right now, it's pre-pandemic, and we see things are still growing at quite a rate. Once they update this for what's happened after COVID-19, you'll see most of the world in red, which is negative growth. But you can explore all around the world where things are growing and where they're not. And I think one of the important things in this graph here, so you can see, if we go back a little bit, when we're in the blue, you can see where things are growing, and when we start getting into the red colors, orange colors, where things are actually contracting. And this is by quarter, so every 3 months. And so let's go back to when it started, which was about 2000, right about when you were born, many of you. You can see that the world was growing quite a bit. And as we chug along, we had the Great Recession right about here. 2008, now things are dipping a little bit in there. So this is where the housing crisis was around the world. And you can see the US really went down, and many parts of Europe went down. China, now let's take a look at China. China is pretty much a blue 4% or more for this whole period. Look at that. China is just staying, one little dip here in 2011 where it turned red, but it's pretty much been blue the whole time up into the pandemic, in which it contracted quite a bit. So China's been growing at a rate of 10 to 12% per year for the last 2 or 3 decades, which explains why they are now the world's largest economy. And so you can play around with that and get an idea of different countries around the world and how fast they're growing. Right? So again, this Great Divergence, as we said in that graph with the sort of hockey stick explosion of economic growth, the Western world believed in trade and globalization. They also believed in colonization and slavery. And so some of that growth is got a pretty dark side to it in terms of how we actually created that wealth. We'll come back to that in a bit when we talk about how we're going to actually share the wealth. That's a different story. So one, there's two stories. One is the size of the economic pie, and that great divergence where the Western economies increased dramatically the size of the economic pie versus sharing the economic pie. And if you're built on colonization and slavery, sharing the economic pie is not exactly equitable or fair or even moral. As I say, we'll come back to that. Today, how do we share the wealth, right? So we got to think about that big expansion of economic growth starting around 1860 and really taking off after World War II. So we got to think about how we share the wealth that we've created within a country, between countries. Between countries, a lot of the West transfers wealth in terms of foreign aid to developing economies. The current Trump administration is not as does not promote foreign aid the way a lot of different countries do. And as a percentage basis, the U.S. is relatively low. Some countries are much higher in a percentage basis of GDP, such as Sweden, in terms of how they invest in foreign aid. Nowadays, we're talking about climate change funds, and the West got rich off of fossil fuels and other carbon-inducing technologies, carbon emissions, and now we're talking about trying to set up a fund so that the emerging economies and the developing economies can leapfrog over fossil fuels to grow their economy without the same level of risk. How do we pay reparations for past colonization? How do we pay reparations for past slavery? And how do we pay reparations for past and current discrimination, either across gender or across races or across religions? These sharing the wealth becomes essentially a political issue because you have the haves and you have the have-nots. The haves that may or may not want to share the wealth. The have-nots may or may not want to share the wealth too. I mean, it depends on how you want to structure society. If you want to structure society as a more down the idea of a winner-take-all society, you're going to get a lot what we have in the U.S., which is a big gap between the richest and the poorest. The inequality level, the concentration of wealth in the upper 1% is some of the biggest since they've been keeping records on this. If you think that it's better to have sharing the wealth, you can go to the extreme of communism, right? Which in that sense focuses in on how hard you work, not necessarily what you produce, right? So there's two extremes. Do you focus on the output and the value of the output, which is what we do in a capitalist society, or do you focus in on the input, your effort, your labor, no matter how valuable it is, right? And that is more down the communist structure of an economic system. We'll spend a whole lecture talking about the difference between capitalism and communism. I won't go into it here, but the nutshell version of it is, what do you focus on? The value of the output or the value of the input? And for capitalism, we focus in on the value of the output. You may have no skill, but you may become incredibly rich in terms of your productivity versus valuing thinking of things on the input side, which is you might have incredible skill, but nobody wants to buy what you're selling, right? So how do we think about those type of trade-offs? But we will do that more fully in a future lecture. Okay, what are the headwinds to the global economy in 2020? You can look at this World Economic Forum. It's a real neoclassical worldview of quote unquote the elites of the world who get together. These are intelligent people who are focused in on trying to think about the global economy as a way to increase the size of the global economy, and they're focused in on it more than they are necessarily focused in on the sharing rules. That's another issue, but let's take a look at this. What we think the headwinds are to the economy. Well, obviously, COVID-19, that's going to be the next lecture. Lecture 4 will focus in on what COVID-19 has done to the global economy and the U.S. economy. Risks to economic stability and social cohesion. I mean, we can see that now with the different pressures in the U.S., the divide between political views, whether you're conservative or whether you're progressive. This gap is as big as I remember it. I remember the gap in 1968 where we had the Vietnam War going on. I was just a kid, but I remember the tensions then. Now these tensions are exacerbated by social media, which is able to distort and push both views to their polar extremes rather than building the sort of middle coalition. Climate threats and accelerated biodiversity loss. The pressure we put on the planet doesn't come for free. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about unraveling of the web of life. We've got to understand whether those risks are real in the sense of, are they real that we can observe and we can manage, or are they real in the sense of there are thresholds we're going to pass that we can't manage things anymore because things start unraveling faster than we can figure out how to solve them. This pandemic is one example of something unraveling faster than we've been able to outsmart the pandemic. We don't have a vaccine yet. We have plans of social distancing and masks, but we can't go to the doctor and take some sort of vaccine that's going to prevent us from this. And plus, the COVID-19 is just one potential pandemic out of potentially tens of thousands of other viruses that could emerge over the next decade. I mean, accelerated biodiversity loss and risks to changing ecosystems is a big thing. Consequences of digital fragmentation. Again, the internet's a great thing, but it has allowed people to create these really strong tribal effects between my group and your group, the us versus them, the zero-sum game that economists have tried to push against their whole career. This zero sum, I win, you lose, I win, I lose, you win, us versus them. Wow, you've never been able to do it as well as you can do it today on the internet. You can create digital fragmentation and create these groups, which also runs the risks of conflict, runs the risks of civil war, runs the risks of bigger warfare, which, as we observed with the Gapminder, the GDP goes down. Yeah, that's a real issue. Health systems under new pressure. Again, as we have new pandemics emerge, the pressure on the health system, the healthcare system around the planet are going to be challenging. Ebola was one. SARS was another. They just continue to exist, and how we handle it is another issue. You can take a look at the report here. You can click on this. Here is some of the short-term risks as a survey for stakeholders and global shapers. I guess you can call them the intellectual elite. And you can look at what people think are the most important short-term risks, including economic confrontations, domestic political polarization, heat waves, as we saw in California just over this weekend. I mean, temperatures of 110, 125 in Death Valley. It's they're real. Global shapers, again, extreme heat waves. Even in Wyoming, when it gets close to 9 degrees, we think that's pretty hot here. But if you're living down in the Southwest, that's really nothing. And the long-term risks We're looking at extreme weather as being the main one, climate action failure, and biodiversity loss. So all these things that are hard for us to get our heads wrapped around in our day-to-day life because we're just trying to make a living, we're trying to go to school, we're not thinking about the planet changing because of our carbon emissions. We're not thinking about the web of life unraveling because of our economic decisions. All these things, we just think we're one small little unit, but when there's 8 billion people on the planet, together our actions in the aggregate are huge. And how do we think about those problems when we're just trying to make sure that we've got enough money to pay the rent or we've got enough money for supper or whatever? Those things don't become important if they're 50 years in the future, 100 years in the future when you're trying to stay alive today. So we'll talk about those in more detail too. All right, finally, there are 4 different views. I'd like you to watch all of these. Some of them are short, some are a little bit longer. There are 4 different PhD economists. Milton Friedman is absolutely the most well-known free market economist. He died a few years ago, but he's one of the great debaters in economic history. He is absolutely convinced of everything he says. This talk he gives back in 1978 is a little politically incorrect today, but it still is probably, well, you should listen to Milton Friedman. Whether you're conservative or whether you're progressive, he is one of the most articulate believers in the free market ever. Esther Duflo won the Nobel Prize last year for her work on poverty reduction. She's also the youngest Nobel laureate in economics. She's progressive. She was born in France. She lives here in the U.S., works at MIT. She's an incredible economist. Thomas Sowell is conservative. He's a defender of capitalism. He works out of the Hoover Institute at Stanford, and he is a real pull yourself up by your bootstraps economist, and he does not believe that sharing the wealth works. Paul Krugman is a Nobel Prize winner again, and he's a progressive economist. He's a columnist for the New York Times. He is a conservative economist. Conservatives in general, he drives them nuts because he's very smart, very liberal, and again, like Milton Friedman, one of the better arguers of our time. I mean, he makes his points, and he makes them sharp, and he makes them clean, just like Milton Friedman. And watching these 4 views, you'll get an idea of why economics is really applied philosophy rather than just a hard science. You know, it's not gravity here. What we're arguing about is ideas and why these ideas matter. And these 4 viewpoints you need to watch. And with that, we've come to the end of lecture 3. Again, email me any questions you have, and off we go to lecture 4.